I'm going to introduce our speaker. So Zara Dowling, besides being my most excellent sister, is is an employee at the UMass Clean Energy Extension. She received her PhD from UMass after completing a research project studying bats and wind turbines. So if you're interested in that, you can ask her about it. So she currently is working on lots of different projects related to clean energy, including this work on solar bylaws. And she also is on her town conservation commission and energy committee. So she knows both sides of it, both the research side and what it means for a town to be working on this project. So with that, I will turn it over to Zara, and I will stop my screen.
Perfect. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. Let me just get this started. Make sure, is it being recorded, guys? Oops.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So hi, everybody. It sounds like there's some exciting webinars coming up. Bear snare sounds pretty exciting. So I'm sorry today if this topic is going to be, we're going to cover some important topics, and I hope that it will be really useful for you. But I'll say up front, this is going to be a lot about regulations and bylaws, and may not be the most scintillating discussion. So, but I do hope it'll be useful. So yeah, like Tessa said, I'm from UMass Clean Energy Extension, and I guess what I wanted to start off with was just the fact that I am hearing some feedback, Tessa. I am not a lawyer. I'm also not a dog, but all this information is based on my understanding of spending a lot of time reading through the SMART regulation, which is the new solar incentive program regulation that we're gonna be talking about today. But I did want to make it clear that I'm not a lawyer, and so if you are updating your town bylaws, as usual, you're going to want to run it by the town council. If you have questions about SMART, you can also reach out to the Department of Energy Resources if it's something that I can't answer for you. And one thing that I'm going to talk about at the end in terms of resources is that the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, which is a regional planning agency, is working on a set of best management practices and an updated model bylaw with language that has been approved by other towns' town councils. So I think that may end up being, I'm sure that will end up being a useful resource. So that's just a caveat, buyer beware, but hopefully this will help you out with your understanding of solar regulation in the state. And it's not advancing. There we go. Sorry, I'm just having a problem with Okay, so why are we talking about this today? Why is it important that towns are planning for solar? I think a lot of you are probably aware that with the latest round of SMART, the original SMART program, it got started in November 2018. And many small towns, especially in central and western Massachusetts, found themselves sort of overwhelmed with permitting applications for large solar arrays, which was overwhelming to town boards. You have to follow open meeting law, so you have to follow all the deadlines associated with that, and just sort of volunteer boards trying to deal with these complicated issues from a variety of perspectives. So the idea is if we can kind of think through the process of updating a bylaw as necessary, thinking about that permitting process and what should go into that, that hopefully municipal officials and boards can be prepared. It's also important because the new state solar incentive program, which we're going to be talking about, includes specific provisions that are related to municipal zoning. So you're going to want to think about how your bylaw is interacting with the state program. And then also, ultimately you want to have a bylaw that's reflecting your community values around land use, aesthetics, and presumably also producing some renewable energy to help power the state. Obviously, there's a number of financial implications for municipalities in terms of payment in lieu of taxes payments, Potentially, sometimes developers will offer reduced electricity rates, either to community residents or to municipal buildings, for municipal buildings, and then the kind of bonds that you want to have set aside for decommissioning of solar arrays. Also, there's public safety implications, especially with the advent of more battery storage. And, you know, on kind of a happier note, if you think about it, this is shaping the future, right? We are going to need renewable energy for a long time. Presumably, we're not going to switch back to fossil fuels after we've made the transition to solar and wind and all those renewable energy sources. So we can probably expect that a lot of this infrastructure is going to be around for a long time. So it's kind of an exciting opportunity to think about what we want our state to look like moving forward. Okay, so what we're going to cover today, the basics of solar PV. I was told by my sister that many people don't even know what PV stands for, so that seems like a good place to start. I'm going to talk very briefly about the history of solar incentive programs in Massachusetts, give you a rundown of the updated Smart Solar Incentive Program, which, like I said, is the active state program, talk about some municipal permitting and zoning considerations, and then get to some resources that are available or should be available soon for municipalities. Okay, so what are the basics? PV, that just stands for photovoltaic panels. So these are, this is solar that's generating electricity from sunlight, as opposed to solar thermal or, you know, solar hot water systems. We're only talking about solar panels that are generating electricity today. When I talk about capacity, that's a measure of the maximum energy production that a solar array can produce basically in full sunlight. And that's typically measured in kilowatts or megawatts. And the capacity of the project in DC is an indication of the size of the project. So for example, a 1 megawatt array covers roughly 4 to 5 acres of land. A typical, I think the average or median household scale array is in about an 8 kilowatt system. I'm gonna have one installed in my house that's about 6 kilowatts. So that gives you kind of a wide range of capacity, but that gives you a sense of what that is. And then the generation is the amount of power produced, which is typically indicated in kilowatt hours or megawatt hours. That's what you get on your electricity. When you have an electricity bill, that's what shows up in terms of how much electricity you used. It's in kilowatt hours. So that's what generation indicates. And if you're trying to figure out the annual generation of a system of a certain capacity, basically you multiply that capacity by about 14% and then by the 8,760 hours that there are in a year to get a measure of how many kilowatt hours or megawatt hours it's generating. Okay, DC, I think we're all familiar with these terms, but DC is direct current. So that's what comes out of a battery. It's what comes out of solar panels. And before it feeds into the grid, it has to go through an inverter and get converted into AC, which is alternating current. All right, that's the basics. We got any major questions yet, Tessa? Are we good? Okay.
Okay, keep going.
Good. Okay. So, brief history of solar incentive programs in Massachusetts. Okay, that's my only joke in this whole presentation. Usually I try to have something entertaining, but solar regulations, like I said, it's pretty dry stuff. So, okay, here's some briefs. Now let's go on to actual brief history of solar incentive programs. All right, so under previous programs, so before SMART, there are about 2,500 megawatts of solar capacity that have been built across the state. So basically, you may be aware that the state has a renewable portfolio standard, which requires that a certain percentage of electricity be from renewable sources, and that percentage is increases every year according to a fixed amount. So that includes all kinds of things. It includes wind energy. It includes solar projects. It's going to include offshore wind moving forward. And some solar has been built strictly under that system, but one thing that they were finding is that solar is a little bit more expensive, at least was more expensive to build and continues to be a bit more expensive to build. So that renewable portfolio standard was not actually supporting solar projects. So within that portfolio standard, they carved out a section of it for where solar projects in particular had to comprise a certain percentage of the electricity that's being used in the state. And this goes through, this is requirements that are applied to the utilities. So like National Grid or Eversource would have to source a certain percentage of their electricity from renewable sources. And then within this, they'd have to source a certain percent from solar sources. And so that's, you may have heard of these SREC programs, SREC and SREC2. And what that stands for is Solar Renewable Energy Credit. So these systems were generating solar renewable energy credits for their owners, who then would sell them at auction and get a incentive in exchange for that. Okay, so that was what was going on previously. Beginning November 26, 2018, so right around Thanksgiving, the SMART program got started, and it doesn't have an actual end date. It was set to continue until 1,600 megawatts of solar had been developed, which I believe at the time the state thought would take about 4 years. But what happened was that the program actually filled up quite quickly, especially in western and central Massachusetts. And so that projects that were trying to move forward in central and western Mass ended up basically on a wait list. And it also triggered, basically a quarter of the way through the program, the state was planning to do this 400 megawatt review to see if they should update or change any of the aspects of the program. And so they started doing that almost immediately because the program filled up so quickly. And those results were announced last September. At this point in time, there's about 1,100 megawatts approved or pending. And I'm not quite sure from DOER's website how many have been built. I think about 152 megawatts of that 1,100 that were approved or pending have been built. So based on that 400 megawatt review, the state did make some changes, and that they filed what they called an emergency regulation, which I'm going to call throughout here just to differentiate between SMART and the new updated version of SMART. I'm going to call it SMART-er for emergency regulation. But that's not official terminology in any way, and you'll never see it anywhere else. But this is just so I can help you differentiate between the two iterations of what is the same program. So the new rules regarding SMART went into effect April 14th. That's when they were filed, and they went into effect immediately. And like I said, it's not a new program. It's just an expansion of SMART. So it expands the existing program by 1,600 megawatts and makes some changes. So now basically the SMART program overall will continue until 3,200 megawatts of solar have been built. So again, there's not a date that's the end date. If you have, once you've heard this presentation or from other things you've read, if you have comments about the proposed changes, I encourage you to submit them before Monday. And there's more details about that at that URL, and also some information later on in the presentation. Okay, so we're going to talk about the basics of SMART-er, as we'll call it. And most of these are also true of the original SMART program. So again, we're only talking about solar photovoltaic systems, things that are producing electricity. In order to qualify for incentives under SMART, they have to be connected to the grid. They also can't, there's a size limit. They can't be more than 5 megawatts AC in capacity. They have to be located in Massachusetts, and they can't be in areas served by a municipal utility. And so what that means is that they have to be in either National Grid service territory, or Eversource territory, or Unitil, which is a company that supplies a few towns in the kind of central northern portion of the state. And so if you live in Holyoke, this program doesn't apply to you, for example, if you have a municipal utility. All right, and throughout, I'm not going to use this terminology because it's a little confusing, but for the purposes of the SMART program, a solar array that's qualifying for SMART incentives is called a solar tariff generation unit, or STGU. So if you see that thrown around somewhere, that's where that terminology comes from. And the difference with this program from the SREC programs is that it's a definite incentive. So instead of having your SRECs go out to auction, you get a specific amount of dollars per kilowatt hour for every kilowatt hour that your system generates if you own it. Whoever the owner of a solar array is, they get a direct incentive in terms of cents per kilowatt hour. And the RECs, which are not SRECs, they're just RECs, the renewable energy credits, go directly to the utility. So they're called tariff payments. I don't know why that terminology is used exactly, but it has nothing to do with trade wars. It has nothing to do with sort of international tariff. It's just a term that's used here. As I mentioned, it's 3,200 megawatts total, including that capacity that's already been allocated under the first iteration of SMART. And at least 20% of capacity is reserved for small projects, less than 25 kilowatts. At least 20% is reserved for medium projects. And that's new with the changes in the regulation. Previously, there was a reservation for small projects, but not for medium-sized projects. Okay, under both SMART and SMART-er, and you'll see if I say SMART at the top, it's because it isn't a change from the original regulation. It isn't a SMART-er change. So under the basic SMART program and under the new updated one, there are certain kinds of land uses where you couldn't build a solar array and get incentives. And those included this list here. So wetland resource areas, unless the Conservation Commission allowed it, properties on the state register, unless the Historic Commission allowed it, permanently protected open space, which as you can imagine is probably protected by other laws and not just the SMART program. And then land that's already subject to a conservation, agricultural, or watershed preservation restriction, unless it's an agricultural project under Category 1, which we will talk about in more detail moving forward. But that's basic land uses that you can't get incentives to build solar arrays on through SMART. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about how SMART incentives work. And the reason that I think this is important is because you're going to want to understand where developers are coming from and what is shaping where they want to put projects. So a SMART incentive has a base compensation rate in cents per kilowatt hour that, like I said, goes to the project owner. And that base compensation rate is based on what utility territory the project is in. It's based on the size of the system, so smaller systems get a higher base compensation rate, and it's based on the capacity block. So the idea was that over time, over what maybe was envisioned originally as about 4 years, that the cost of solar development would go down. So as capacity was filled, the incentive rate would go down over time slowly. But like I said, the program filled up very quickly. So it may be that those sort of decreases in solar development costs over time were not realized over the amount of time that the SMART program has gone so far. And given trade wars, actually, I think the price of solar panels at least has increased. But that was the idea. The capacity gets filled up. The price of development declines, and the incentive can decline with it. Although I know from talking to some solar developers that they were finding that it actually was getting very tight to make a profit on the project. So that's just kind of some information. Anyway, base compensation rate. Then there are certain adders, additional incentives that you can get for certain types of projects. We'll get into that. And subtractors for projects that are on undeveloped land. There are actually subtractors that reduce that base compensation rate. So we'll talk more about that as well. Okay, so here's just an example of the range of base compensation rates. The kind of grid that you see is from block 1. So that was when the base compensation rates were the highest. And so you can see there's a range, I think, of about 14 cents up to 39 cents for block 1 for, so if it's a really small project, you only get a incentive for 10 years if it's less than 25 kilowatts, but that incentive is quite high. And then relative to larger projects. And then for larger projects, you get a 20-year incentive, but that rate is lower, especially for very large projects, and especially for projects in Western and Central Massachusetts, that rate that you get is lower. Obviously, if you're on Nantucket, it's there are a lot higher construction costs to get equipment out there. So in Nantucket, for example, the compensation rate is higher, and in Eastern Mass, the compensation rate is a bit higher. Currently, most large-scale projects are filling capacity for around block 8, so that range of base compensation rates is about 12 to 31 cents. Okay, that's base compensation rates. Okay, let's talk about smarter adders. There's an adder, you get an additional cent, about 5 cents per kilowatt hour for energy storage systems, and that's for any size project. The advantage of energy storage of battery systems is that they can even out that flow of electricity to the grid, which kind of counteracts some of the problems that we have with trying to integrate renewable energy into the grid, in that they're kind of changeable about when they're feeding electricity into the grid. So if you incorporate energy storage, you can smooth that out, which is really advantageous for grid stability. So there's an adder for that. If you have a tracking system that follows the sun, that's a new technology that's more efficient, but it's also new and it involves more components. That gets 1 cent extra per kilowatt hour. There's a new adder for pollinator habitat, which is 0.0025 cents per kilowatt hour, and I'll talk more about that later. And that's for putting in pollinator habitat underground mounted arrays. Then there's also off-taker based and location-based adders, which we're going to talk about in more detail. So, off-taker based adders. You could get an extra 5 cents per kilowatt hour for putting in a community shared solar project. And basically what that means is that a lot of people are a lot of customers are drawing electricity from that system. So they have a power purchase agreement typically with a large scale owner. So you may think of community shared as a bunch of people getting together and sort of having a co-op system where they all have ownership of the solar array, and that typically, there are a few towns where community residents have tried to get together and do that, but there's also a lot of logistical and some legal hurdles to that. So most of the community shared projects that we see are a large developer owns the system, but is selling electricity to a number of community residents, and so that gets an extra 5 cents per kilowatt hour. There are adders for certain low-income solar types of solar development. And then there's a 4 cent adder for a public entity solar array. And we'll talk more about that, but basically if that electricity is going to a municipal building, a school, or some other government entity's building, that's an extra 4 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's important for municipal officials and volunteers to be aware of. Then there's additional incentives for certain kinds of locations. I would say the places where people often say they'd prefer to see solar. So you get an extra 2 cents for a building mounted unit, an extra 3 cents for putting the solar array on a brownfield, an extra 4 cents for putting it on a landfill, an extra 6 cents to put a canopy over a parking lot, and an extra 6 cents for an agricultural, what they call dual use project, where you have the panels higher up and further apart and are continuing to do agriculture underneath, which I'll also talk a bit more about in a moment. But I guess what I'd want to say here is that cost is based on what DOER has said, and DOER is the Department of Energy Resources. So based on what they've said, this is basically just to level the playing field with development of ground-mounted solar, because it actually does cost more quite a bit more to put a canopy over a parking lot because of all that additional steel and having to design so that if a car rams into the array, it doesn't fall over or something like that. So one thing that I've heard from developers is that unfortunately, even that 6 cents per kilowatt adder is not necessarily making a project as economically viable as just a ground mounted array. So that's something to be aware of. But anyway, so here's the location-based adders for development on some of what we might think of as preferred sites. Okay, so what does that all boil down to? That was a lot of information. Then those are the incentives, but then they end up feeding into categories. So all of those location-based projects that I was telling you about end up in category 1. And so a project that's not category 1 and non-agricultural would include any project that qualifies for a location-based adder. So any project that's building mounted, a canopy over a parking lot, brownfield, landfill, etc., is going to fall into category 1. A new thing with the Smarter program is that public entity projects, so any project that is feeding a municipal or other government building, is going to fall into category 1, no matter what the size. Small to medium-sized projects, so less than 500 kilowatts, which is about a few 2 to 3 acres of land, those small projects fall into category 1. And then if it's a large project, but it's on land that was previously developed, you know, like an old parking lot or something like that, that will also fall into category 1. If the project is on agricultural land, which is defined as important farmland soils or Chapter 61A properties, again, if it's qualifies for location-based adder, it's falls into category 1. If it's a small project typically, but one that's sized to meet no more than 200% of on-farm loads or on-farm annual usage. So basically, no more than 200% of what the farm is using for its own operations, that falls into category 1. And then these dual use projects, which like I said, the panels are higher up and further apart. And the idea is that agricultural activity is continuing under the panels. And there's a picture of one of those systems that is a small system at the UMass Research Farm down there in the right-hand corner. And I guess what I just say about that really briefly is that that's been met, I would say, with a mixture of enthusiasm and skepticism from the farming community. So, you know, some farmers are looking for an additional revenue stream, and they're very excited at the prospect of potentially continuing to farm the land while also getting that revenue from solar. But on the other hand, I think especially for less so for livestock grazing or haying, but more so for, you know, vegetable or fruit production, there's been a lot of concern that basically this is kind of hamstringing the value of the land, if you will, that it's making it a lot more difficult to farm. And so people aren't, some folks are pretty concerned that this isn't really a way to promote sort of viable agriculture across the state. So it's really sort of been a mixed reaction to those kind of projects. But I think with that in mind, the state has tried to keep those kind of small or fairly small, smaller than the maximum size of solar projects, and also limited how many megawatts of those projects can actually be produced so far. Okay, that's category 1. So then there's category 2 and 3, and these types of categories apply, basically they only apply to large ground mounted arrays on undeveloped land. So projects that are greater than 500 kilowatts. And one of the changes with Smarter is that those types of projects can no longer be located on habitat that's biomap 2 core habitat or critical natural landscape, or on parcels where more than 50% of the land falls into those categories. So that categorization, if you're not familiar with it, is something that Mass Wildlife came up with. And they did a lot of analysis across the state, looking at rare species and looking at important habitats. And so that designation is has to do with land that the state considers of high conservation value. So under the new the Smarter regulation, these large-scale projects can no longer be located on that type of land. And then in addition to that, these large-scale projects get a subtractor, which was in the previous program but has been increased. So category 2 projects and category 3 projects, they're all large ground mounted arrays bigger than 500 kilowatts. And if they want to fall into category 2, which only gets half a subtractor, they have to have local zoning that is either zoned for commercial or industrial development, or the project has to be in a solar overlay district, or the zoning has to mention something about power production, power generation, or solar, as that is allowed. So if it mentions that, the project falls into category 2, and it gets what's considered a half Greenfield subtractor of 0.00125 dollars per kilowatt hour per acre of solar panels. So I think that's important. They say it's relative to the project, but it's important to recognize it's not based on the footprint of the full solar array project. It's based on the actual square footage of the solar panels themselves, is how that per acre is calculated. For category 3, it's just basically anything where the zoning doesn't address commercial, industrial, or solar development, and it gets a full subtractor. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize this because I think this is important to think about. So category 1, basically, you get a base compensation rate. You have the potential for location-based and other types of adders. There's no Greenfield subtractor, and there's no requirements for land siting. Category 2 and 3, you get a base compensation rate, and you have the potential for some types of adders, but not location-based adders. you do get greenfield subtractors, and you do get subject to land siting requirements. So you might recognize here that even if you have a large project on undeveloped land, there's a strong incentive for the developer to try to get it into category 1. And so that's just sort of one of the takeaways from this slide. So hopefully that summary makes some sense. But basically category 2 and 3 always applies to large projects on undeveloped land, but some large projects on undeveloped land could, through the rules, fit into category 1, if that makes sense. Okay, now I'm going to just talk really briefly about the changes from SMART to SMART-er, because you might see some projects, if they're currently in the permitting process, grandfathered in under the original SMART provisions. And that's my great-grandfather up in the corner there overseeing the presentation. So there were no Biomap 2 land siting restrictions in SMART, as I mentioned. So there were no land siting restrictions that would keep you from getting incentives by putting a project on Biomap 2 under SMART, but now there are. Under the new program, greenfield subtractors have been increased by 2.5 times. Under SMART, projects that were in solar overlay districts or where solar zoning applied fell into category 1, so they didn't get any kind of subtractor. Now they do. Now they get the half subtractors, category 2. There also is no public entity exception in SMART. So now, like I said, if you have a project that's a public entity project, which we're going to go over, that project ends up in category 1. The public entity adder has also been increased in SMART-er. So there's a lot of incentive to try to have a public entity project. The pollinator adder is new, but it can be applied to existing projects, and energy storage is now required for large projects. Also, importantly, the Eversource East and West utility territories have been combined into one big capacity territory. So why is that important? And what does that actually mean? So originally, if you look, the sort of top part of this this table is looking at small projects, which are less than 25 kilowatts, so residential scale projects. That's not really that important to us in terms of solar development on the landscape. But if you look at this large projects down below, you can see in the first column where they're accepting applications. And you can see that as of May 5th, when they had kind of paused the SMART program, after they just announced the new updated emergency regulation, that Eversource West was on a wait list, as was National Grid territory, which includes a lot of Western and Central Mass as well. While Eversource East still had 371 372 or so megawatts of capacity remaining to be filled. And meanwhile, Eversource West had about 56 megawatts that were on a waiting list because they had already exceeded the total capacity that could be built there. So I think what's important to take away from here is that now that this program SMART has been opened back up, and now that Eversource East and West are combined, we can, in a way, probably expect even more development and more permitting requests to come forward in Eversource West territory, because all that capacity that was initially going to have to go in Eastern Mass can now be cited in Western Mass. So that's sort of the takeaway here. So what am I trying to say for municipal officials? What do I think that is important? One, what I just said about Eversource East and West territories being combined. We can expect to see more interest and more development, again, in Western and Central Mass municipalities, as long as there are sites where the grid's not already saturated, where there are opportunities for the for solar to interconnect to the grid. And so there may be another large influx of new permitting requests. So that's important to realize. Also, as I mentioned, developers have the strong incentive to pursue public entity projects because they don't have to worry about siting those projects. They can go on land on this Biomap 2 land that is otherwise restricted, that you can't get an incentive to develop on otherwise. And that they don't have to deal with the greenfield subtractor. They get a 4-cent per kilowatt hour adder. And then there's also looser restrictions regarding application material deadlines. So there are incentives to pursue those public entity projects. Also, local zoning matters. It determines the size of that greenfield subtractor. If you're doing development of large projects on undeveloped land. And I think it's important to realize that that category 2 subtractor may not provide a huge amount of discouragement to greenfield development. And the reason I say that is that I did some math based on what DOER had available. And basically, if you had a 2 megawatt solar array, I think you would get, even with the subtractor, you'd still get about 95 or 96% of the original incentive. So it's only a small decrease, at least for moderate scale projects, on the incentive that you're getting. So it doesn't necessarily provide a lot of discouragement to develop in greenfields. As a project gets very large, it would be a larger percentage of that incentive. So it might be more of an effect, but.
Zara, do you mind, there's a question in the chat box, do you mind qualifying the definition for a public entity project? And the question from Bruce Howard is the percent of usage that defines that.
Yeah, I have a slide coming up that's taken directly from the regulation that will answer that question. So let's hold off till that. But I believe that it's all the energy, all of the electricity has to go to a public entity. But I have that text a little further on. So that's a very good question, and let's hold it for a second. Okay, 2 other takeaways. Community shared projects receive a significant financial adder, 5 cents per kilowatt hour. And so I'm not trying to say that, creating a community shared project does for the developer require a lot of legwork and a lot more administrative work, right? Because they have to get all these different customers interested in having a power purchase agreement and being signed on to get electricity from that solar array. But they are getting a financial incentive to do it. So if a developer comes to you and says, hey, we're interested, we're going to do this thing where we also give a discount to the community, be aware that they are getting an additional incentive for that. And also, energy storage is required on these new large projects. And so that does bring up some kind of fire safety issues and thinking about where the best places for those kinds of large, at this point, what is large battery systems to go. Okay, there it is. Look, it's the next slide. I guess I anticipated that question. So public entity project can be either on public land or on privately owned land. But it either has to be owned by the municipality or some other government entity. So if there's a state facility in your town, they would be allowed to have this kind of project. And 100% of its output has to go to government entities. And I think the only wiggle room I see there is that I don't know that it all has to go to your municipality, or if there could be other government entities that could also get a portion of it, if that makes sense. So that might be a good thing that I can try to clarify with DOER, if 100% of it has to go to the town that it's in, or the government entity whose land it's sited on, or if it could go to other government entities. But 100% has to go to some kind of public entity, whether if it's wherever it's sited, or the array has to be owned by a public entity. Okay. Hopefully that's clear. And then the other thing that we talked about was kind of the difference between category 2 and category 3 projects, right? And the idea that if you want to get a half subtractor, you have to fall under category 2, which means that you either can do that if the project is in a commercial zone, an industrial zone, or if it meets municipal's solar zoning law, bylaw. So if there's a solar overlay district, that's pretty clear, right? You can cite the project there and you'll get a category 2 subtractor rather than a category 3 subtractor. But if you have any mention of solar in that zoning bylaw, whether it's that solar is allowed by special permit or that it's allowed as of right, it also is going to fall into that category 2 instead of category 3. Unless that zoning also limits the scale of the project and says, hey, it can't be more than 500 kilowatts, and then it's going to be a project that would be category 1 anyway because it's a small project. So for large projects, if the zoning mentions large scale solar or just mentions broadly energy generation as a potential use, then it ends up falling into a category 2 instead of a category 3 project. All right, so when you're drafting your bylaws, what else do you want to take into consideration? So I guess that's sort of the end of the sort of SMART program section. Does anyone have any questions about that that are really pressing, or I can also answer them at the end?
If someone needs to unmute themselves at this time, they're allowed to.
Okay, I'm gonna keep going, but I'll have plenty of time at the end for, like, I can stay on the call if you have questions. All right. So there's a few things I just wanted to go over with municipal bylaws about solar. One is that I know some people have been concerned that if they change their municipal solar bylaw, that they may make themselves ineligible for the Green Communities program. And I want to make it clear that I really don't think that's likely to be a problem. So the criterion one of the ways that you be a green community requires that you allow as of right siting for renewable generating facilities or research and development facilities or manufacturing facilities. So not like anyone's going to do this, and not that the Green Communities program would be happy about this, but basically you could allow a renewable energy manufacturing facility in your town, like a place that builds solar panels, and not allow any solar development in your town, and you wouldn't be, you would still be in compliance with Green Communities requirements. But you know, probably a more realistic scenario is that you allow small scale solar in certain parts of your town or throughout your town, and then you allow large scale development in areas where that makes sense. So, you know, I don't think you, but in short, you don't have to worry that you're going to fall out of green community status by updating your solar bylaw, because you're going to be allowing you're probably going to be allowing residential solar as of right throughout the town, or perhaps at least in major portions of the town. So just by doing that, you're meeting criterion one. The more important thing to consider when you're updating your bylaw is Massachusetts zoning law, which says that no zoning ordinance or bylaw shall unreasonably regulate the installation of solar energy systems. So what does it mean to unreasonably regulate? Well, Mass Department of Energy Resources does have some guidance, but what they say, and what the Attorney General's office, which reviews municipal bylaws, also says, is that there's not really a lot of court decisions to guide a town about what qualifies as an unreasonable regulation of solar. And so it's very important when you're making amendments to your bylaw to consult with your town council. So this is frustrating, right? Because I'd like to give you really clear guidance on what is okay to do in your zoning bylaw and what isn't okay. But that guidance just isn't available. But I think one of the takeaways that I've had from talking to folks at the state is that they don't think it's unreasonable to say we're going to not allow solar in certain residential districts, for example. And they didn't seem to have a problem with that. On the other hand, I know that there is a town in Western Mass that was not allowing solar, large-scale solar, in certain residential districts, and they got sued in land court, and so far they have they lost that initial suit, which the folks I talked to at the state seem surprised by that. So that may not stand, but it's important to recognize that this is really a gray area. And I think one of the things to consider when you're doing this, we'll certainly look at what other towns have done and, you know, sort of gotten away with or whatever, what other towns have passed through their town council, and maybe it's been in place for a few years and they haven't had litigation, but also just sort of consider what's reasonable. So if you have an updated bylaw that in effect means you can't develop large-scale solar on 95% of the land in town, that's probably unreasonable. But if you have a bylaw that ends up saying, okay, you can't do it on slopes that are greater than X, Y, and Z, and it means that, you know, I don't know, 15 or 20% of the land is off limits for solar development, that's probably not that unreasonable. So unfortunately, this is an area where it's very gray, and, you know, I wish there was a clearer answer, but I think that there will be moving forward. But at the moment, you kind of have to rely on your town council and looking at what other towns have done. So I don't know how I'm doing on time. Okay, we'll try to kind of zip through. So this is sort of just a laundry list of some of the bylaw and zoning considerations that you might want to consider when if you're updating your solar bylaw. And I think a major one is just thinking through the permitting process and all the required documents that you are going to want your municipal board or municipal officials to review. Because, you know, once you get an application that you accept and consider complete, you end up being locked into all these strict timetables. And then if you're making more information requests back to the developer, you kind of end up in these endless meetings. And I think that's one thing that a lot of volunteer boards have found challenging, is that these permitting projects just drag on and on and on to get the project approved or disapproved. And so if you can say, here's all the documents we require up front, and then moving forward, if you get an application that is substantially incomplete, you can say, well, we can't accept this application yet. You need to, you know, we have this list of what you need to send us and you haven't sent us all those things yet. That can kind of limit the number of meetings that you have to attend and request for new information. Certainly you want to think through zoning that reflects community preferences. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. I know one thing that some towns have done is to try to streamline permitting for the kinds of projects that they really want to see. So I believe the town of Athol is considering just having building permits for canopy and building mounted systems required for a solar array in that town, rather than having to go through a special permit or site plan review process. So trying to streamline that process for sort of more straightforward solar systems that you might want to see developed. Setbacks, I think one thing that's important to think about is noise. The inverters from the solar arrays do make noise, but even more so if you're talking about a large scale array now with the battery backup system, with the battery systems, they may require actual air conditioning to keep the battery cool in the heat of summer. And so that can generate more noise if they're close to neighbors. Visibility, one thing that was Athola has been looking at is sort of view shed analysis and glare analysis to see if it could be, if the array is going to be a danger. And this is mostly talking about large scale arrays, a danger to motorists or just kind of affecting the general rural character of the town. Lighting, making sure that that lighting is facing down and not sending a lot of light pollution up and again bothering neighbors. Thinking about if you want vegetative buffers to hide the view of the solar array from the road or from neighbors. I'm going to talk more in a couple slides about that pollinator-friendly certification, and that's something that you can consider adding for large-scale projects into your bylaw, or put into the order of conditions or the permitting that you want to see pollinator-friendly development. Slope, so you want to limit the steepness of the slope that these kinds of systems are installed on. Thinking about stormwater design criteria and the management plan, and especially with climate change, if we do have more intense storms, if you want to up those requirements. Making sure that adequate sedimentation and erosion control is in place. Thinking through pilot payments and also decommissioning funds. And especially with decommissioning funds, thinking about what form you want those funds to be in, because typically solar developers that develop the project are that often, not always, there are some companies that retain the project, but a lot of developers then sell the project to a different company, and that company might sell to a different company. And so 20 years down the road, you know, 20 or more years down the road, when you're ready to, when that project's ready to be decommissioned, it's not going to be owned by, quite likely, by the same company that initially developed it. So what form of fund will be available, and making sure that's secure for the town. Just a few quick thoughts in terms of thinking about solar photovoltaics and community preferences. I know there's been a lot of concern across the state about land use and the development of open space for solar. And there's been a number of studies that have suggested that maybe about 75% of the capacity that we're seeing in solar that's going in has been on undeveloped land, primarily forest land and secondarily agricultural land. And Mass Audubon just came out with a recent report that said that solar development is starting to represent a really significant proportion of new development across the state. So I think certainly one thing towns are thinking about in terms of that, their updated bylaws, is protecting open space that is important to them in the town. And I think that Biomap 2 requirement will contribute to that, but that's an important thing to consider. On the other hand, you know, the state has set greenhouse emission reduction goals, and some towns are starting to say they want to go 100% renewable, which is really a great goal. So the question is, how do we get there? And recognizing that developing projects that are sort of on sites, the kind of sites that we might prefer, or that are small or medium scale projects, typically the costs are higher than they are for a large scale project. There is an economy of scale here. So recognizing that there is a trade-off, that the cost of energy is going to be significantly higher if we are trying to put projects onto some of these preferred, sort of what we might think of as preferred locations, like parking lot canopies and the like. And then I guess the other thing to think about is sort of the scale of projects and how quickly they can be deployed. So a 1 megawatt ground mounted solar array takes up 4 or 5 acres of land. I looked up the median size of a solar array in Massachusetts for a household level scale is 8 kilowatts. So you'd have to build 123 of those to get to one megawatt ground mounted array. So there's a lot of different trade-offs to consider, and certainly worthwhile to think about what the values are in your town and what direction you want your zoning to go. Aesthetics, I thought this was a good example. Again, I think this is from Athol. There was a solar array that was put in right near a spot where folks like to go up and see the sunset. So, you're thinking about areas that might be important from a conservation perspective, but also perhaps from a community perspective. And I know one thing that this town has done moving forward is that they've asked if the poles can be placed out along the driveway to the solar facility on new projects, so that there's not this sort of giant conglomeration of power poles. But I just think that's sort of a good example of one place where aesthetics, even just having poles in a line instead of in a big grid, can make people happier. And in that case, the developer was able to do that, not in this project, but a different project where that was asked for. Erosion is definitely an issue, especially during construction, and if the site isn't stabilized. And this is a site where there was a solar array being constructed uphill from a cemetery, and there was a kind of a large storm, and the cemetery got completely flooded. So that's certainly something to think about. So those are just sort of some examples of some of the kind of things you might want to be thinking about. I don't think that this list is basically, there's things that you can put into your bylaws, and then some of those things that you can also consider when you're working through permitting a particular project. And just remembering that you can do third-party consultation. A lot of towns have accepted an article at town meeting that allows them to have a third-party consultant who is chosen by the town, paid for by the developer. And so that can be helpful with stormwater review and other review of plans. And again, this is sort of a list of similar to what I mentioned before. For conservation commissions that come into play if there's a wetland in the vicinity, there is some guidance from DEP, but if you have additional questions, really don't be afraid to contact your Mass DEP circuit rider. And again, you want to coordinate with the other boards in town. You're again allowed to have third-party consultation, and impose the restrictions that are necessary to make that project go forward successfully without having an impact on the wetlands. So requiring regular site checks, and maybe that ends up being weekly at some stages of construction. And you can use your discretion in the wetland buffer zone and ask for limited vegetation management in the trim zone. So as an example of sort of some of the vegetation things, components that you can ask for, UMass Clean Energy Extension, so who I work for, as recently we've come up with a pollinator-friendly solar certification program. And basically what this entails is that when a developer is doing development, if they want to certify their site, they have to plant native plants and follow a set of criteria, which are available on our website if you want to take a look. And recently with this the smart emergency regulation, the state has allowed that if they meet this sort of silver level of certification or something comparable from another entity, then they're eligible for that small additional incentive, which is with the idea that that would offset the additional cost of purchasing native seed at the outset of the project. But anyway, so if you want to check out the details of that, you can do so on our website. And the idea is that instead of, if a town has certain ideas about exactly how they want an array developed, they can write that into the permitting requirements. But if you more generally want something in your bylaws that says you're going to develop a site with native plants and follow some wildlife management guidelines, then you can just refer to this certification instead, and that way you don't have to be constantly updating, because we'll be making changes as more information becomes available. And if we start seeing that there's certain kinds of wildflowers that do really well under those arrays, as opposed to other kinds, then we can kind of point people in that direction. So definitely take a look at the details on our website, but it basically includes a lot of guidance about planting native plants that are beneficial to pollinators, and then incorporating some other elements, most importantly having a gap at the bottom of the fence so that you're not impeding wildlife passage for at least small wildlife like turtles. And then for some of the higher levels of classification of certification, you can have things like kestrel nest boxes, or nest boxes for other birds and that kind of thing. Okay, so general resources. I mentioned that there were public comments available. You can put in public comments about this emergency regulation. That's through Monday, and that's the website to do it, and that's the email link to do it. All of the details of the SMART regulation are on the state's website. I'm not saying that it's easy to follow, but they're there, and there are some guidelines about land use that are a little bit, that are a little clearer language, not such legal language. If you want to look at the progress of that capacity as it fills, that's at the masmartsolar.com. And if you want to zoom in on your town and look at that biomap 2 habitat and what might be ineligible for incentives for category 2 and 3 projects, that's at this link. It's just a sort of a mapping tool that you can go to and zoom in on certain sites. If you want more information about that dual use, agriculture and solar, or pollinator-friendly solar, you can find it on our website. And I should say with the emergency regulation that these, like I said, these rules are in effect. They went into effect in April, mid-April. They're in effect now, but because they're not final regulations, they could change following those public comments. So also check back on our website to see if there are updates to how the program works. Some municipal resources from PVPC. I just got some sample text. If you're worried about getting an influx of applications and you are working on updating your bylaw, you have to be actively working on updating your bylaw. You can impose a solar moratorium, and a number of towns have done that. So there's some example text if you want to do that on our website. DOER has a model solar zoning bylaw, which is worth taking a look at, but many towns actually did model their original solar bylaw off of that. So you may have already taken that into account. MAPC, which is the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission, does have a guide with some information about solar permitting and zoning. And we're working on collecting information on our website at this link. And then in terms of, I guess I didn't speak a lot about battery storage today, but people are starting to be concerned about fire safety around these large battery storage systems. And I reached out, Mass Clean Energy Center, which is out in Boston, as opposed to Mass Clean Energy Extension. Mass Clean Energy Center is starting to try to put together some information and thoughts about best management practices for dealing with energy storage, because that is a push that the state's making across the whole Commonwealth. And I don't think I think they've been really busy with other projects, so they haven't devoted a lot of time to it yet. But one thing that as they get that information, I'll put it up on that website link that I have right above that bullet point. And then in terms of fire safety training, one thing that Mass Clean Energy Center did recommend was that firefighters take this training, which appears to be free, which is good. But you know, when you're thinking about costs for the town, you may want to be thinking about if there's additional equipment that's needed. And as we get more information, I'll try to put that up there as well. Some forthcoming resources. As I mentioned, PVPC is working on this updated model solar bylaw and best management practices guide, which I think is going to be incredibly helpful for municipalities, expected to be completed fall 2020. UMass Clean Energy Extension, so us, we're working through a grant from the National Renewable Energy Lab with 3 towns, Blandford, Wendell, and Westhampton, on a project to kind of start thinking through how do you have the community decide where they want solar to be sited, and then also financing models so that towns can say, this is where we want to have solar, and then find ways for solar to actually be built there and have those community benefits come back to the town. So that's a project that we've just got started on. You know, we're not unfortunately going to have results available right away, but the project's going to be completed in June 2021. And out of that, the plan is that we'll have templates for how other towns can do this and be able to work moving forward with a lot of you all to make that planning process happen. We're also working with a number of regional planning agencies on that, 5 college, UMass 5 credit union, and a number of local solar developers. And then pilot agreements. I just wanted to say, you know, one thing I've heard from towns is, you know, they have to go out and negotiate these payments in lieu of taxes. And so we're looking for feedback regarding what kind of information would be helpful and of use to you in terms of those agreements. So for example, would you like to have a database of example pilot agreements to go through, or sort of a spreadsheet with town by town pilot comparison of what terms were gotten from a solar developer? So if your town has a pilot agreement with a solar facility, I assume since it's an agreement with the town, it's public document. If so, please send me a copy. And if you have thoughts about what would be useful, what kind of information would be helpful to you moving forward, please let me know. All right, that was a lot of information. Sorry to go over and sorry to do so much talking, but here's my contact information if you have more questions.
Thank you, everyone. I know some of you had to head out, but I appreciate your time. So also, I wanted to acknowledge our co-hosts, which I forgot to do in the beginning, MACC, the Massachusetts Association of Conservation Commissions, and the Appalachian Mountain Club were co-hosts, as well as obviously the UMass Clean Energy Extension. So I am putting in a link to the UMass Clean Energy Extension page for resources for municipalities into the chat, so that you can copy that right to your computers. I'm also about to link to a survey about this webinar that it would be great if anyone would be willing to give us feedback so that we can improve our webinars in the future. And if you haven't already, please put your name into the chat box, recording of who's here. And then I will start, as soon as I copy in the link, I will start going through people's questions. 1 second. I've been keeping track. I guess so, Zara, first off, someone's kind of generic definitions. What constitutes a large project and versus a small project? And is there any information on how small a project could be and can be considered reasonable under, I know you said it's a gray area.
Yeah, so there's not a legal definition for the term large. If you have your own bylaw, you might define what a large system is in that bylaw. But the way I was using it throughout the presentation, a large system is one that's bigger than 500 kilowatts, which is what the state, so if it's a project that's under 500 kilowatts, it falls into that category 1 designation. So that's why I was using that terminology. So if you kind of look at what the SMART program, I would say a small project is 25 kilowatts or less. A medium project is 25 to 500 kilowatts, and a large project is greater than 500 kilowatts. Yeah, and because it's such a gray area, I can't, yeah, there's not an answer for what would be considered unreasonable in terms of the scale that I can put my finger on. So that might be a question for a town council, but I would say that the state is limiting these projects in terms of what gets incentives to 5 megawatts AC, which is, I don't know, it's sort of still an arbitrary thing, but maybe that's something you could limit them to. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's a really good question. And maybe that's something that will come out of the review of different town bylaws across the state. If there are towns that have limited I guess if there's anyone listening that has a town that has limited the size of a solar array project, it would be interesting to have that bylaw. So if you happen to have a copy of it, please email it to me and I can send it out to the questioner. And then I guess one other thing is that I know some towns have limited the acreage of forest that could be cleared for solar array development. So even if they didn't limit the size of a solar array, they did limit how many acres of land could be cleared for solar development for a given project.
So we have, I guess, follow up with that. How many acres for a 500 kilowatt project? A speaker says there Pelham has a limited to 1 acre, but that seems too large.
Well, a 500, so like I said, a 1 megawatt project typically covers 4 to 5 acres. So a 500 kilowatt project would be about 2 or 2.5 acres. And that's in DC. Now, when a project feeds into the grid, if it has battery storage, it might have a lower AC effective size. But if you're talking, DC is sort of what's closely related to the footprint of the project. And so that's what you're sort of interested in. So 2 to 2.5 acres is a 500 kilowatt project.
So this is kind of going back to earlier conversation about the conservation restriction. If the question from Elizabeth Roblica, if the land is protected by a conservation restriction and solar is put on the roof of a barn, would that qualify for incentives?
It depends on how the conservation restriction is written. So often there are envelopes, right? Tessa, you and Sally can probably speak to this better than I can, that there are often a conservation restriction will have some kind of carve out where there's a certain area that development can go on, or a building mounted structure. So my guess would be that it would probably still qualify for incentives, but it would depend on the way that the restriction was written.
Thanks. So next question, are there examples of zoning issues, conflicts, unintended consequences that arose under SMART that were meant to be addressed by SMARTer?
Yeah, I mean, I think the major one is that the state, the state does, my understanding is that the state does want to continue to see some greenfield development because they want to continue to see large projects that are really economical go forward. But I think they did talk a lot about the balance of greenfield development versus other kinds of development. And although they never defined what ratio of sort of building and canopy mounted projects to greenfield development they wanted to see, I think that Biomap 2 and increasing the size of the subtractor were both indications that they were trying to alter where projects were how many large ground mounted projects they were getting and where they were being located. So I would say that was one change. And then the other change is that fact that they moved projects that were in line with solar zoning from category 1 to category 2. And that was at least in partial recognition of the fact that towns didn't, ultimately maybe they should have moved them to category 3 if they wanted to not have local zoning have an effect. But I think the takeaway there is they were trying to say, initially they were trying to say, well, if the town wants to have solar here, we're not going to put any subtractor on it. But by moving the projects the projects that are in solar overlay districts or meet solar zoning to category 2, they were still applying a greenfield subtractor to those projects. So under the original SMART, about 60% of large ground mounted projects that supposedly should have gotten this greenfield subtractor weren't, because they were following that solar zoning exemption and they were getting into category 1. Now they're in category 2, so they do get some subtractor. So hopefully that's not too confusing, but that is an example of a change that I think reflected thinking about local zoning.
All right, so the next question going down, oops. And this kind of relates to the public entity projects. what does it mean to say the total output is assigned to a municipal body? Does it mean power as it is generated or a kilowatt hour equivalent of energy generated by a solar installation? I don't know.
I mean, I guess in the sense that like all energy is feeding into the grid, right? So it's not like it goes necessarily you know, even if you have it on your house, when you're not, if you have a residential system on your house and you're saying 100% of this energy is going to me, it actually just feeds into the grid, right? And then 100% of it is assigned to you. So you use some of it flows into the grid, you get some back. And this is this whole net metering concept, where you get credit for all of the electricity that you generated in your system on your house. And then, and if you end up using more than that, then you have to pay for what you used. And if you end up using less, then you start generating these credits for the amount that you've generated and aren't using. And so over time you start saving up credits that then maybe you use in the winter when your system's producing less. So it's sort of my understanding is it's a similar concept with the public entity adder, where obviously that electricity is flowing into the grid, but if all of the credit for that electricity is net metered to the municipality, or the municipality, I believe if there's a power purchase agreement and the municipality is buying that electricity at a reduced rate, that would, but basically it has to be assigned in some way. And yeah, the details of the legal side of that is something I'd have to look into. So that's a good question, but it's not like all that electricity just flows to that building. It feeds into the grid and you get credit for what you're generating.
Thank you. So the next question is about the pollinator program.
Yes.
And the question is, are pollinator-friendly plantings really feasible on solar installations on sites which forests were cleared? So I guess, can you turn a forest pre-fort into a meadow?
A lot of the pollinator-friendly development that's been done so far has been done out in the Midwest. And so it's more in prairie habitat. So this is a new, sort of new research out this way to see how well this works. But I guess what I would say is it will work in some fashion. The question is what species do the best, and what, you know, maybe in a few locations if the soil is particularly bad, there might need to be some kind of soil amendment before that wildflower mix, you know, wildflower meadow mix goes in. But yeah, I don't think that there's not going to be ways to establish plants under arrays. It may be that some of the initial mixes that people start out with don't do as well, and we might have to reseed with some other, you know, add in some other species or something like that, or find that some sites are more effective than others. But I don't think that there's just going to be sites where native wildflower plants won't establish. It's just going to be sort of a matter of what do best. And yeah, and you know, in coming up with the guidelines and this best management practices document, which goes along with the pollinator certification, we've tried to talk to organizations like the Xerxes Society, which have done a lot of work establishing wildflower meadows, to kind of find out what are best management practices given what we know, and that will be amended moving forward.
Great. So the next question is, if a moratorium is enacted, may it end up being much more restrictive than the current bylaw?
I mean, a moratorium can be very restrictive, right? The idea is that it's temporary. So you're not allowed to just impose a moratorium willy-nilly. But if a town is saying, hey, we're actively working on this updated bylaw, we need time to do that. And the one example that was sent to me was 10 months. I think sometimes people say 6 months. Maybe you could say a year. You know, we're going to approve this at our next annual town meeting, or not approve it, but we're going to revisit this at our next annual town meeting. So a moratorium can be very restrictive, and some towns have even said we're not going to allow large-scale ground-mounted solar development. That's sort of a typical one for this time period, whether maybe it's 6 months. So yes, a moratorium can be very restrictive, but the idea is that it's temporary. And I think one thing to be careful of is that you're only restricting what you want to restrict. Because I know one town was saying they restricted all ground mounted solar, and then some poor guy wanted to put a little residential system at his house and he couldn't put it on his roof. And because of this moratorium, he couldn't put it on his property either. His ground, he couldn't do this ground mounted system. He had to wait until the moratorium was over, or maybe they were able to give him an exemption. I don't know. But so making sure that you're only restricting what you want to restrict when you do it.
That's fair.
If you do it.
Question, yeah. Nuanced. Does on-site energy storage eliminate the 5 megawatt cap for large-scale ground-mounted projects?
That's a very good question, and it's something I should have covered in better detail in this. So it does not, but it changes the nature of it. So the cap that the state has imposed is only in megawatts AC. So the cap on the size of a system under SMART and SMARTer is 5 megawatts AC, but the battery storage occurs before the conversion to AC. So you have a DC system. Part of that electricity can feed into battery DC storage, and then it goes through the inverter into the grid and is converted into AC. So basically, if you had a system that had no energy storage and it was going from DC to AC, if you had a system that was 5 megawatts AC, probably the largest that it's going to be in DC is 6 or 7, maybe 7.5, but really 6 or 7 megawatts DC. But once you add in energy storage, you can have a much larger system. So you might be able to have up to something like a 20 megawatt DC system. So you can have a much larger system that still is feeding into the grid at 5 megawatts AC. So it means it has a very large footprint relative to what you might think of as a 5 megawatt AC project, but it still is feeding into the grid at 5 megawatts AC because any excess power or electricity generation is being stored in those batteries and then fed into the grid at night when the solar panels aren't generating any power. So, from a grid stability perspective, like I said, this is a very good thing. But from the perspective of if you're concerned about really large arrays going in, it does mean that having energy storage means that much larger arrays can be built. So if we're talking 20 megawatts DC, we could be talking an 80-acre project.
Thanks. The next one is, are SREC auctions still going on? Is there a link for them?
They are still going on. And because like I said, SREC 2, I think for residential systems, you could still get SRECs into 2018. And I don't know for larger scale systems if it ended in 2017 or 2018, but for the residential systems, I believe you get SRECs for 10 years, the same way that you get SMART incentives for 10 years. So there will still be SREC auctions going on through I guess into 2028, unless the state radically changes what it's doing. But there should be SRECs going on through 2028 at least. And then I don't know the details of the SREC program, but if the larger scale systems had a longer time period that they get SRECs for, then we would expect that would continue even further. But yes, there are still auctions going on. I can try to find that link, but I guess what I would just do is Google DOER and the SREC program, and you should get some information. And you could also, Mass Clean Energy Center has a portal through which solar projects under SREC were, that tracks usage, and that they sort of also figure out how many SRECs were generated. But typically, if you're a residential scale system, you then sell those, work with an aggregator to sell those SRECs in bulk. And there are floors and there are floors. I don't know if there's a ceiling. There's definitely a floor on the price. So you get at least a minimum price during that auction for an SREC. But anyway, you can, yes, there are still SREC auctions going on, and it shouldn't be that hard to find that information.
And there's kind of a you were asking for input from the community. Has anyone considered the revamping the building standards so that all new development can support building or roof mounted solar might be reasonable to put development in the east?
Yeah, and there are solar ready, there definitely is example language for solar ready requirements for new buildings. So that's a good idea. That's something that I can track down and include on the Solar Resources website.
Okay. And then some people are still on the line, so we'll keep going. So Lori Sanders had a couple of thoughts on what you were asking about. It would also be helpful to discuss how to approach waiver requests by applicants from the town bylaw and how the planning board members should respond. And that she says, I'd welcome language that will address maintenance provisions to deal with Japanese knotweed, Asiatic bittersweet, and other species that can take off in these disturbed settings. So kind of just food for thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And those are the questions that I was keeping track of. I don't know if anyone's still on the line that wants to speak up.
Yes. Hello. This is Jenny Curtis from Westhampton. I was wondering if I could ask a question concerning clean energy.
Yeah.
One of my major concerns that the state has not been addressing is a recycling program. And if we're concerned about the economic impact of solar on rural communities, I want to know, is the state under the clean energy program discussing this? Because we know right now that China is the major producer of solar panels, and we've been told at one large scale, this is for large scale commercial, that the developer would not use made in USA solar panels because it was more expensive for him. And this was a developer from New Jersey. And when you just stated that the energy storage issue was going to become more of an impact, larger battery systems were going to be required, I believe Massachusetts really has to address these backup battery systems because of the fact that they are made with lithium. And lithium is basically mined in South America, and there are toxic chemicals that are used in mining lithium, and they've been proven to do harm in terms of the ecosystems and food production. And so we need to address when in 15 years these batteries are going to have to be disposed of, whose responsibility is it and how are they disposed of? And if we're really concerned about global climate change, we have to look at the dirty side, if you will, of solar in our state. And I don't want to see our rural communities left with the burden of having to, under the decommissioning policies, left holding the bags.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that's a great point to bring up about decommissioning, that making sure that it's in the solar developer's court or owner of the facility's court to do the decommissioning, and that if they kind of disappear from the scene, that you have a decommissioning bond, some kind of decommissioning fund in place.
Oh.
That was what I was saying about having it be a fund that is sufficient to cover the costs of removal and recycling of solar panels. But you're right, also the energy storage system. So
but the state right now has no recycling policy for solar panels. And I'm asking, will the state please consider establishing?
Well, I would encourage you to write that in. I don't work for the Department of Energy Resources, but I would highly encourage you to put that in your comments, public comments regarding the emergency regulation. And there also is there's a lot of energy storage research and work ongoing. So I am sure the state has had this sort of big push for energy storage to kind of, from a grid stability perspective. But you're right, there are a lot of other kind of environmental health long-term questions about that. So it does make, I would take a look at Mass Clean Energy Center and DOER's website, because they have a lot of information about the work that they're doing related to energy storage and related to solar. And I'm sure that it's something, there are a lot of smart people working at the state, so I'm sure it's something that they're considering, but whether it's a big initiative and they're really, working on that specific issue, I don't know, and I can find that out for you and share that information.
Well, I would just like to in terms of our solar bylaws, I would like to be able to see in some fashion the state, when they are producing these model boilerplate solar bylaws for small communities to have to follow, because we don't have professional planners, to be able to give us the option of saying that solar panels could be made in the United States, and that specifically these large-scale batteries would have to be disposed of as one of the conditions in the special permitting process, rather than, because 15 years from now we have not a clue how much it's going to cost a small community to dispose of lithium-filled batteries.
Great, and I think we need to move on to the next question, but I would say that in terms of your town bylaw, I don't think that the state is going to provide guidance on that immediately. It doesn't seem like they're making an update to their model bylaw, which is why I was really encouraging towns to look at what the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission puts out, and I'll bring that up in their bylaw discussions, that some consideration about energy storage and decommissioning energy storage. There should be some language about that also.
Great, thank you very much.
Yep, thank you very much.
So for the public comments, the DOER, from a land use point of view, what are the most significant weaknesses in the April 15th revisions, the smarter revisions?
Well, that's asking me to take a political stance, so which I think the weakness of it depends on what you sort of what side of it you're coming at it from, right? So I think a lot of environmental organizations, we're very pleased to see those Biomap 2 restrictions, whereas the solar developers who are concerned about bottom line economics, were, in at least large scale developers, were very concerned about those Biomap 2 land siting requirements. So if you're looking for sort of talking points for a public comment period, I think who I would go to is depending on sort of where your political feelings align. But I know that some of the environmental organizations that have been working on this and sending out information to their members include the Appalachian Mountain Club, the Massachusetts Association of Conservation Commissions. You can get in touch with them. Mass Audubon, based on their Losing Ground report, has also been concerned about solar development. So those are some environmental organizations you could reach out to if you're wanting to get a kind of solar industry perspective. I believe it's CBANE is the Solar Energy Business Association of New England. There's also a Vote Solar group. So I'm not going to take a stance, but if you're looking for talking, basically UMass Clean Energy Extension doesn't advocate for any particular legislation. But what I would recommend that you do is reach out to an organization that your views tend to align with if you have concerns, and I'm sure they'll be happy to provide you with talking points.
Let's see. There's other comments. A quick comment of, doesn't New England want to be a forest? How will pollinator fields be prevented from becoming forests? I assume that relates to mowing regimes.
Yeah, certainly the pollinator-friendly, the idea is that you're mowing less frequently than you would be if you're just mowing sod. But typically if you're not mowing every year, the goal is really to get to mowing kind of about 1/3 of the site a year, so that you're in a 3-year rotation. Because yes, ecological succession is a thing, and woody plants will start to grow up. So there is still mowing involved, but the idea is that it's less frequent than with just turf grass.
All right, is there anyone on the line who has a outstanding question, or should we call it for now? And like I said, this recording will be shared out with everyone who has attended and everyone who RSVP'd, along with a PDF of the slides.